Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Everything Bagel podcast. I'm Aaron.
I'm Jody. On this particular episode, we had poet David Livewell. David's poems have appeared in just about every prestigious journal out there, and his book, Shackamaxon, with Truman State University Press, won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2012.
Shackamaxon's a great word.
It's a great word.
The conversation was really, really great with David. It was our first poetry topic.
We wanted to do something for National Poetry Month, and I'm feeling so fortunate that we were able to get David here on the Everything Bagel.
So it's National Poetry Month now?
It's still National Poetry Month, yes, throughout the entire month of April.
I knew that. I was just making it like a little bit.
Oh, okay.
The month of April is National Poetry Month. I'm married to a poet. Of course I know that.
Well, I love that comment he made about dark gratitude. Did he coin that? Where does that come from? I want to use that.
Sounds right up your alley.
It sounds right up my alley, yeah.
I think we're going to title this podcast Pandemic Poetry Month just because, well, for obvious reasons. And it was a nice conversation to have. He called us from New Jersey.
Where they have the real thing with bagels.
Yeah, his bagel choice was good.
It was good.
Yeah, and our thanks to David for joining us. He had some great insights.
Yeah, he knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, I thought this was a wonderful first poetry podcast. Yeah, enjoy, everyone.
Enjoy.
Thanks by W.S. Merwin. Listen, with the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We are running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our directions. Back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging, after funerals, we are saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. Over telephones, we are saying thank you. In doorways and in the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings on stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks, we are saying thank you. In the faces of the officials and the rich and of all who will never change, we go on saying thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, our lost feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forest falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you faster and faster. With nobody listening, we are saying thank you. We are saying thank you and waving, dark though it is.
Talk to me about that last line. And I got to ask you because when I read that, and you read it beautifully, by the way, is this an uplifting poem, or is it the opposite for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of Merwin I would call something like dark gratitude. Yes, he is truly saying thank you because this is the world, but the world is so imperfect and cruel, and so much of it, we have made it that way. I mean, if I was going to not see this ending, I would think he would end on the words thank you.
Right, exactly.
But it's that crazy little phrase at the end, just like at the beginning, he starts with listen. And then he ends with that little phrase, dark though it is. So, I think that says it right there. Here we are thanking the world, even though it has a whole lot of darkness in it.
It's why we chose it, because there's some darkness around us right now, I think.
Sure.
I think it's the place we wanted to start by asking you and Jody too how poetry has been turned to, maybe for you or for others that you've been around in these maybe dark times?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hearken back just in my own lifetime to right after 9/11.
Mm.
You know, I remember there were certain poems that went around. There was a poem in the New Yorker, try to praise the mutilated world, and people were passing that around, and it was published in that issue that was just black on the cover. And then I remember people sending around the W.H. Auden poem about 1939, because that had some similarities. And there was a Seamus Heaney poem about towers falling, and people were sending that around. So, you know, I do think that poetry arises out of great pressure when it is written.
Yes.
You know, just the way a diamond is made out of coal. So I think it's always good. Poetry is perfect for extreme times. You know, some of the best poems came out of the oppression in Russia, or the troubles in Ireland. You know, some of these places that had great pain. The poets kind of tend to rise to the surface. I kept seeing during this, people were talking about how Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the bubonic plague.
Right.
And, you know, even though we ain't Shakespeare, it does show just how humans can adapt and take a pressurized situation like that, or a time when they are confined in some way, you know, just like great novels or poems coming out of someone who's imprisoned. Sometimes that can really make for that pressure situation, and something good can come out of it as far as the art goes.
I've been surprisingly finding myself reading, believe it or not, Sylvia Plath, who is the least uplifting poet one could think of. So I guess it sort of brings up the question for me: why would I find comfort in reading the darkest of poets during a dark time? Wouldn't I want to read the most uplifting poems right now? Wouldn't that be more sort of nourishing for me? But there's something about reading dark poems in dark times that works.
Well, and David mentioned, like, during 9/11, those poems that surfaced, right? It's maybe not darkness or light, but appropriate for the time, or apt for what we're experiencing. Right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be, oh, I'm feeling depressed, so I need something to make me feel better, or vice versa.
Right.
As opposed to, God, I'm feeling away, and let me explore that, consciously or subconsciously.
Let me read an external manifestation that's beautiful of how I feel.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many poems that are totally happy either,
Yeah,
and I
true.
don't say that in a pejorative way, but I do think at the heart of poems that they're all really elegies. You know, poems are either about love or death, and you're usually losing love, or even during love, you know that death is coming. You know, because we're always living and dying simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something about just putting something down in a permanent way that seems to defy death and oblivion. And almost the act of writing itself is a form of rebellion or resistance against whatever the outward pressures or fears are.
And what is a feeling of love if you're not comparing it to the feeling without love?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, think of a love song. You know, think of some great love song. There's always that tinge of sadness in it too, because we know that it is fleeting. And that it's something rare.
I guess I'd be interested to know, David, what are you reading right now? What is offering you comfort at the moment?
Well, it's funny. I turned from poetry totally, and I thought I would read something that I always wanted to read, and that I always gave an excuse that I didn't have time for, and that was Marcel Proust. So I thought, there's no way I'm going to finish it during this quarantine, because it's huge.
Right.
And I thought that it would just immerse me in another world. So that's what I've been doing. So when I'm not working at home, and we also have a 17-year-old son who's working, doing his schoolwork at home, and my wife's working at home. So when all that is done, and I have any free time, I'm trying to just immerse myself in this Proust.
That's so interesting. So that it's not poetry that you're turning to right now, but it's sort of diving into a completely different world, somebody else's world.
Yes, and a lot of times when I'm trying to write things myself, I don't want to read other poetry because I might tend to mimic it too much, or the influence might be too much. So sometimes it's good to read a very good novel or something that's totally different than your voice when you're trying to write, your own stuff. I don't know if you find that.
I find if I'm working on a poem, I don't want to read prose because I'm afraid that my poetry will get too prosy. That I'll hear the sort of like the weight of I'll feel the weight of the prose in my own poems, and they won't be light and musical enough unless I'm reading really, really excellent prose that is itself quite musical.
I see. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I work in forms more. So because I'm usually in such tight musical forms anyway, sometimes I really need to break out of that, and I want to hear some prose that has more length and breadth to it.
Can I ask? It's a related question, but it's from a non-poet and non-artist. I play guitar. I have
Right.
for a long time, but I write very few songs. But I've sometimes when I hear a Beatles song, or I'll hear a solo by Eric Clapton or whatever, it freezes me. It turns me into some. I go, I could never write that. Why
Yeah.
bother?
Yes.
And so I'm interested to hear how you two
Oh yeah.
handle that, and it's related to what we're talking about, right? To say when you're in a writing mode, whether you read poetry or not, and how it influences your head. How do you guys square that?
I feel
Yeah.
that way when I read Donald Justice. I get a little depressed because he's so good. And I feel like, oh God, I could never write a poem that good. What am I even doing with my time?
Yes.
On the other hand, I also get depressed if I read a really bad poem because I'm like, why did that poem get published? It's horrible. I could do better than that. And it's actually more motivating for me to read a bad poem than it is for me to read a good poem. But Donald Justice is the one that really kind of gets me in the heart with how good he is and makes me feel depressed about my own writing.
I used to talk to Richard Wilbur about this,
Right.
because he said he would turn to Robert Graves when he wanted to be, kind of inspired into writing his own work. And even though Graves was very different, he felt that he would never try to imitate Graves, and it would just spark something in him. But then if you spend too much time with, say, someone like Yeats, you'll start to sound like Yeats badly. and you'll have to stay away from that. I mean, I think it was probably more of a problem for me when I was younger, and you have that notion that you're trying to find your own voice, and
Right.
what is that, and it has to be, this unique voice. But then I remember when I was an undergrad and I had my writing mentor there, he taught me quickly that the only way to learn is to imitate.
That's right.
And so you don't worry about that. You don't know what this unique voice will be. So you just have to learn your craft, just as if you were, learning how to make chairs. And you just try your best to learn all the tricks of the trade, put more things in your toolbox, and try to imitate these things that people do who move you, and see how it ticks. Open it up and look inside, and see how these things are going, and then those things will take care of themselves as you get older and your own inclinations come out and you experience more of life. Like he used to tell me, at 18 you have nothing to write about anyway. you haven't had enough life experience. It doesn't have to be factual. What's that Emily Dickinson line? Tell the truth, but tell it slant.
Tell it slant, right.
Right. And it takes a long time, I think, to learn that you can use things, even things that didn't necessarily happen to you, but they better be true. They better be true to the human experience, or they're going to stand out like a sore thumb and come off as false.
And it's interesting what you say about opening up the poem and sort of seeing how it ticks, because for me, there's always this element of magic to a poem that, I mean, writers and artists call it alt sorts of different things that I wish there was some sort of formula to that magic. Have you been able to sort of have a sense of how to recreate the magic through any of your, say, your formal training in meter and rhyme?
Yeah, you can only go so far. I mean, there are little tricks. There are ways to slow a reader down. Once again, I think of music. There are the rests and the pauses that can slow you down. If you write in a minor key, that it's going to pull at the heartstrings a bit more, or a certain tempo. So I think there are those things in the craft. You know that if you put a hard stop in the center of a line, that it's going to slow the reader down, and that whatever you're talking about better have something to do with that. It better be happening for a reason. I learned little things like, try to avoid ending a line in an adjective, how to cut out everything that's not needed, and each draft should get a bit shorter, little things like that I think can be helpful. But to try to capture lightning in a jar is always going to be, something that comes from a lot of talent and a lot of luck.
Can we talk? How did you get into this? Like, what's your journey as a poet, but as a formalist poet?
Yeah, it probably wasn't a journey that should have ended up here at all, wherever here is. But I grew up in a poor working class neighborhood in North Philadelphia, and it was a very mixed neighborhood. And I guess one of the things that appealed to me early on was the various voices around me. I like to be a mimic. And I would try to imitate maybe an old Hungarian neighbor's voice or one of my friends' voices. And I liked going over different people's houses that had different kinds of food and had a different kind of cultural experience. So my grandfather loved to tell jokes. So I loved to hear his old time jokes and stories from his memory. He remembered all the way back to 1910. He was born in 1905. I would walk around the neighborhood with him and get all of his stories about which buildings used to stand where and how things were different. And when I got a tape recorder, I would tape record some of these talks that he would give to me at night. And so when I first got into writing, I guess first it was rock music, and I thought I wanted to be a lyricist or a songwriter.
Ah. There it is.
Yes. So I had a teenage band and went through all of that. And I was very influenced by, all different people that wrote lyrics that surprised me in some way, whether it was Tom Waits or Neil Young or Van Morrison or whatever. I was very much on the word side, of that.
You mentioned you listened to the Cover Songs pod. So you obviously heard what I had to say about Tom Waits.
Yes. Yes.
I respect his songwriting so much because I tend to gravitate towards the sounds first, not the lyrics. Right. And Tom Waits has always been so off-putting for me. I think Closing Time is his one good album. That's what I always say.
Yes, when he didn't sound like Tom Waits.
Exactly.
That's the only one my wife will listen to, because she says, "Are you going to put Cookie Monster on again?" and I'll play a song for her because she loves jazz music, and she loves the old standards. And I'll say, "Look, he has written a new standard. This is an incredible standard." And she'll say, "Well, I wish someone else would sing it."
Exactly.
So when she hears someone else do one of his songs, so she's the same way. She respects him so much as a songwriter, but she wishes that he never opened his mouth.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry to digress here. You were telling us about your journey.
And then I thought, as I got to know people in high school and I brought them down to my neighborhood, I realized just what a crazy and unique place it was, just from their reaction to it. Because it could be very violent, and there could be lots of really strange characters. And I was used to all of this until I saw it through their eyes. So then I thought I should document this because it seems unique. So I started taking photographs, and I wanted to photograph everyone in the neighborhood and every place that I thought was interesting. And I thought maybe I would use them to write stories about the place. I wanted to use it in maybe the way that Joyce used Dublin, where I would have these interlocking stories or characters that floated from story to story. And then by the time I got to college, I started to be more taken by poetry. I had this great poetry teacher, and I saw that poetry wasn't a subject matter for him. That it was a matter of sanity, and it was something that was a rock in his life. And he had been a Marine in World War II, and he had 6 kids, and he had also grown up in a poor North Philadelphia neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started to see what poetry had done for him, I turned more towards that. And then I got up enough guts to take him a little stack of poems and ask him if he would read through it. And he looked at me after he read them for about a week. He called me to his office and he said, "Have you ever tried fiction?" And I was devastated. And he said, "You have no idea what poetry is. You have a tin ear, and that tin ear comes from rock music."
Oh.
So I had no idea what he was talking about, and I thought this was going to end it. And then he said, "Except for these 4 lines." And in the middle of the stack I gave him, he had these 4 lines, and then he spent a half hour telling me what I didn't see in my own 4 lines. And he said, if you can hear these lines and see what they are calling you to do, try to build on that and come back to me. And so I remember I was devastated, and I called my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and I told her I was never going to write again. And she said, "Don't you see? He's challenging you. He wants you to come back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He's a writing teacher. This isn't going to be easy." And so I came back, and then he picked out a couple other good things that I did, and then he gave me a bunch of vinyl records of poets reading their poetry.
Oh, right.
He gave me T.S. Eliot and Frost and Robert Lowell, Dylan Thomas. And so he said, just don't even try to understand what they're saying. Just hear the music. He said, picture that you're listening to a conversation through a door, and you can't make out what's being said. You're just catching the cadences.
I can't help but think this. Jody does this, has done this for years. I'll pick up her iPod years ago, and to hear some music, and there's Robert Frost, like with his gravelly old 80-year-old voice reading some poem. I go,
"Something there is a touch of love."
Exactly. Yeah. And your experience with your mentor resonates very much with my experience working with Bob Mezzi, whose poetry I admire very, very deeply, and who's also a close friend and is my only poetry teacher. But I really had the same experience, similar experience when I first met him. He read some of my poems that I'd written in high school and said, He said, "Well, looks like you've got some talent, but you have no idea what you're doing."
Yeah.
And he said, "We're going on a diet of reading strictly metrical poetry." And he started sending me his translations of Borges, and I started listening to Frost, listening or reading his own poems, and sort of a lot of the similar stuff that you went through. And he was very, very hard on me.
Yes.
He would tell me to throw things away and start over, or say that's not a poem. But, that worked for me for some reason. I mean,
Same here.
In other aspects of my life, you tell me that my jeans are on the floor, I'll have a meltdown. But with poetry, I needed someone to really come down hard on me and set the rules and make them clear and set the bar very high for me to respect them. And it just worked. And it sounds like the same thing happened with your mentor.
Yeah, I mean, and he was a Marine, like I said. So I really think it took a Marine to do that from me, and he came from a very similar place. And as a young person, you're attracted to, like, a lot of my friends were reading the Beats, and so I would come to him and ask him what he thought of Ferlinghetti or Kerouac or something. And he would never bash someone, but he would look at me. And he had this very intense stare.
Mm.
And he would say to me, "This is not a game. This is a matter of life and death."
Wow.
And he would walk away. And so he just had this intensity where when I tried to take it to some place where like all young people think that it's a bit entertainment.
Mm.
And I think especially when you're into music, you think, part of this is the performance of it or the lifestyle. And he kind of blew all that out of the water for me and said, no, this is a craft, and this is a serious art. And, you don't write for fashion and fads. You write for eternity.
I love that.
This is something, and you're in conversation with all the other great poets before you, and you have to be ranked up against them, and you should constantly be looking to them. Because I remember I would get very confused because I would say to him, well, what are some poetry journals that I should subscribe to, or what current poets do you like? And he would say, it's not about that. You're not responsible to your times. You're responsible to whatever gift you've been given, and you have to immerse yourself in that gift. And so it was just this concept of a writer like no one else I was experiencing, even as an English major, and having other English professors and hearing what they said about different writers, and they would concentrate on their biographies or their madness or their alcoholism or whatever titillating thing it was about them. Whereas I saw with him, it was always the work itself, freestanding and in front of him, and whether the work worked. And he didn't care if that person, was a murderer or an alcoholic or whatever. This works, and this is why this is a great work. So he was very into that idea of close readings. And so all of this was totally new to me, and I had no idea what he was talking about. It took a long time, but slowly I abandoned the fiction prospect, and I just got totally immersed in poems. And I found his poems in the library, and I just started asking him more and more questions, and then I had a course in Seamus Heaney. And this teacher loved Richard Wilbur. And so I was in the library one day, and I saw the Who's Who books, those old reference books that listed anyone who was anyone in any category.
Right.
And so I looked up Seamus Heaney, and I looked up Richard Wilbur, and I decided that I was going to write to both of them. I have no idea why I decided this. So I wrote to both of them, and lo and behold, they both wrote back to me. And so first it was just kind of a fan letter, and they wrote back to me. And then I asked them if they would be willing to look at some things I was writing. And then those correspondences lasted the rest of their lives. So by senior year, I decided to start a literary journal. And some of those same writers, Anthony Hecht, Seamus Heaney, Dana Gioia, was in some of our early issues. And so that was great, because I got to see work that was not old and sitting in an anthology, but work that was being done currently at that time and was, showing up in my mailbox. So that really got me motivated too. And it got me into editing, and I think being a better closer reader. So it was a long, circuitous route. Vernal Song. My days now numbered, trees grow spare. One sees that it has all been done. By what right do I beg for spring? I've given only crumbs for birds, In memories fit, the handfuls scatter. My days, now numbered trees, grow spare. The gods waste us to our delight, beyond our vision and our words. By what right do I beg? For spring I have a kinship in these bones, but like breath upon a mirror pass my days. Now numbered trees grow spare to stay the gods. Immured in light, they live a song whose burden's pain. By what right do I beg for spring? Those speeches slurred and words forgotten, how humbly we wipe clean our slates. My days now numbered, trees grow spare. By what right do I beg for spring?
Can you say something about your use of repetition in this particular poem and also in general, how it works for you?
Yeah, and I guess this is something that goes back to my love of music as well. You know, you think of a refrain in music. These things drive themselves into the memory. And when we repeat things, we tend to remember them. To make this kind of not be something that is just totally rote, where it gets boring. I tried to vary the grammar in each line, the punctuation in each line, so that it would vary. So so you see when I say my days now numbered, comma, trees grow spare. Then the next time I use it, I say my days, comma, now numbered, comma, grow spare. And then I make it a hard stop, my days, period, now, comma, numbered trees grow spare. So I tried to find a line that syntactically could be very elastic. So you would still hear these kind of chimes and remember that it was said before, but I was trying to use it in a new way. And as the drama builds in this, kind of make it stand for something else.
Do you think that by varying the punctuation and sort of working with, as you described, the elasticity of that line, it has a different impact versus just sort of hitting that same note over and over again? Because for me, repetition tends to have a snowball effect, regardless of how you use it. So how does, varying up the punctuation impact that in your mind?
Yeah, well, all linguistic art is variation on a form, right? That's what we're always doing, is we lay down some kind of norm and then we put our variations in it, trying to make them hold some kind of meaning or some kind of drama to them. So I guess I knew I was going to come back at the end and have the line with no punctuation again, as if there was some kind of clarity. By what right do I beg for spring, with no stops in there, because that's how it appeared in the first stanza. So I kind of had that set, and then the other variations, I guess, were just ways to keep the rhythm going and to keep the drama going.
When you use the comma and you use the period, it's a familiarity more than it is a repetition. When I first heard it, it brought out this familiarity in me. I go, oh God, I've heard that before.
Yes.
But something sounds different to it.
Right.
There's a familiar, not the same, but familiar, huh? And there's like an echo to it.
And it puts the reader on the edge, I think, a little bit, because you want to see how it's going to be resolved.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to keep bringing it back to music, but I remember I listened to an interview with Miles Davis one time, and the interviewer said to him, doesn't it make you nervous when you lay down a melody and then you do all these variations and then you have to work your way back to it? And he said, if you're not nervous, you're not paying attention. In that great Miles Davis voice, you're not nervous, you're not paying attention.
Right.
And I think it's the same with poetry. And this is one of the things I think that you can get. This is one of the powers of form, is Richard Wilbur has an essay about form where he talks about form being like the genie's bottle. The genie has no power without that compression and force of keeping it confined in that bottle. And that's what gives it its own confinement and restraint, gives it its power as well. And I remember really being blown away when I read that by him, because I never thought of form as giving a power. I thought of it as something that was pleasing or pleasurable or a way of ordering an experience, but I didn't think of it as this powerful thing. So I think I became a lot more interested in trying to do those kinds of things in form.
I want to go back to your mentor for a second. Well, I love his comment about poetry not being a game. And I think that's so important, especially now, because a lot of poets do write in a way that's sort of like a game. They're not deliberately trying to communicate. They're not considerate of the sound. They're not thinking about what this poem is actually doing for the human spirit. And right now, we are in a time when people are desperate to have their spirits nourished. And so I wonder if that will have this sort of impact on poetry to sort of bring us back to the real thing.
Well, I hope so. I mean, a lot depends on education. He would tell me about his education and all the poetry he had done up through high school, before he went away into the war. And it was amazing. And amazing how much poetry they had to memorize. So I'm also big for rote memorization of poetry. And I think just like in music, when you have a piece memorized, then you can improvise, and then you can look at it at different angles, but you have to somehow internalize it. And he was very big on that, and that was one of the reasons of listening to the LPs, was to hear it so often without seeing it on the printed page that it became a part of you. So unless grade schools start to teach it that way again, where kids have this, little kids love nursery rhymes, and little kids love playful language. And when I say that that he said that it wasn't a game, he of course still meant that you use playful aspects in it, and you still use pun, and you still use pleasurable things, but he used to call it difficult pleasures. And he would say if someone sits down to do a crossword puzzle, they want it to be challenging. If someone watches a game of sports, they want that sport to be difficult. And yet with poems, a lot of times people just want it to be this immediate experience that can be given out in a poetry reading at one hearing. And that's not the kind of poetry that will sustain, repeated readings and, like you said, be there for you. When you come back from a funeral, you're not going to sit down and read a Ginsberg poem. At least I don't know anyone who does. So he may have been experimental, and he may have been at a particular historic time that was important. But to be taken by his stuff, the way people are taken by some of the greats, like a Wallace Stevens or Richard Wilbur or something, I don't see him at that at that same level.
To be interesting is not in and of itself to be important.
Right.
And how do you memorize a Ginsberg poem?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we could talk about this more when we talk about form, but that's what I learned so much, was that the main decision in poetry is when to end a line. So if there's no reason to end a line, then you're really just writing prose. So whether it's Whitman with his breath units, or using an almost a biblical kind of rhythm, or whether it was T.S. Eliot, who used some musical structures, all these people that people hold up as great free verse writers all had their own kind of restraints that they put on it, because you have to know when you've come to the end of a line, and when to go to the next line. And so that just becomes a whole lot easier when you're writing in some kind of form, even if it's an invented form.
And you can hear the ghost of the meter in good free verse poetry too.
Definitely. And they're still using alliteration, and they're still using syllabic constraints. They're still using some of these other subtle things. It's very difficult to find great free verse that doesn't have any kind of constraint to it, whatsoever.
Similar to your example that you brought up earlier about you can only improvise when you have something memorized. I wonder with both of you, is the same kind of construct true when it comes to the quote rules of poetry or form, in that you can only break free from that form or those rules when you've mastered or understood what they are?
Yeah, I think there has to be a reason for it. So when you're breaking from it, it has to be something that's going on at that particular point in the poem. Maybe something to do with the dramatic point in the poem. So, say if you're talking about someone who is coming up short in some way, so you drop a foot from that line because you're saying that something is not enough. So therefore you're not giving enough. Or you put excess into a line because something excessive is happening, or a violent scene is happening. So you're using lots of Anglo-Saxon words and lots of hard consonants. So these things aren't always deliberate in your conscious mind, but I think from doing it over and over again, you start to pick up on that kind of thing. And then when you're going back and revising it, you sometimes see how you did it instinctively, but how it was done for a reason.
There's accounting for taste in this conversation, but there is a tradition to this art form that doesn't exist in all the art forms. I mean, I can pick up a guitar and play a song without knowing or appreciating Beethoven or Bach.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like poetry feels a little different for me in that regard.
Well, that's because you're married to me.
Well, maybe.
A lot of people would say that you don't need to know anything about the tradition of poetry, and anyone can sit down and write a poem as well. And maybe if you were married to a classical musician, they would say what you're doing is blasphemous.
Right. And it's funny how someone can be a cutting-edge songwriter, but they can still use rhyme, whereas a modern poet uses rhyme, and they're looked at as conservative and old-fashioned, and a throwback. And that's one of the strange things I think that happened with formalism, was it began to be seen somewhere along the line as conservative. It was almost like a political statement. That must be this stodgy guy in a bow tie who is a right-wing Republican if he's writing a sonnet.
It's so strange that it's a male chauvinistic form of writing in
Yes.
poetry, but anyone can do it in music, in songwriting.
Right. I mean, the current rapper can rhyme so much more than a current poet, and yet it is not seen as old-fashioned or stodgy.
I think the pendulum will swing back in our direction, David. I don't know when, but I think people are going to get sick of reading poems that are just prose cut up into random lines, and they're going to realize that what really serves them and nourishes them is the stuff that's survived the test of time. And more often than that, those are the poems that are musical and beautiful, and that are in some sort of meter or form or deal with
I think
rhyme.
so. But Aaron, like when you're picking up that guitar, you also have all the songs you've ever heard locked inside your head. Mm-hmm. And most of them you've heard many times. And unfortunately, say a sixth grade or an eighth grade kid now does not have a whole store of poetry in his or her head.
Right.
And so when they hear something, it doesn't chime back to this kind of bin of echoes that's in their head, and they remember being a little kid and finding that pleasurable. And I think that's what used to happen with other generations, is they would remember nursery rhymes. They would remember Robert Louis Stevenson. And so when they heard, say, a new Robert Frost poem that rhymed, there would be this pleasurable thing that took them back to when they were young, and they remembered that early pleasure of rhyme in something that was, much simpler. And maybe it wasn't about all this darkness that he was talking about, but it still rang this distant bell.
I imagine even if it wasn't pleasurable as a child, it's still in there.
Yes.
You called it
right.
a bin of echoes? That's great.
That's amazing.
Because an echo doesn't have to be positive or negative or whatever, but it's an echo. It's still there.
Yes, I mean, you have, this land is your land, all old folk songs or hymns, all in there. And all those things are kind of bouncing around. And whether you realize them or not, when Leonard Cohen wrote Hallelujah, all these hymns that he had ever heard were bubbling to the surface. And he was writing a new hymn.
I'm going to take a more optimistic perspective on this and say that even though children are not taught Frost and Robert Louis Stevenson as much as they used to be, or as much as maybe we hope they would be, that perhaps hearing a Robert Frost poem as an adult, say for the first time, will still hearken to something innate in our human experience. Even if we didn't get it as a kid, it will still speak to something rhythmically and truthfully inside of us that might be new for the first time, but is still very real.
Yeah, it's primal. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these things that come out, and it's just that people have to open themselves to it. That's one of the things that always bothered me about National Poetry Month, is that you're only supposed to have this out there for 1 month of the year, and not all the time. And so I would rather see the attention given to early childhood education in poetry and song and wordplay and, all the joys of that, then put into 1 month where suddenly there's a poem written, on a subway sign, or something that most people aren't even going to look at.
Does National Poetry Month, does it matter? Do your habits change? Does your work production change? How does it affect you?
National Poetry Month was something that was created in 1996.
Oh, really?
So it's a relatively new phenomenon. And I actually disagree with you a little on this, David. I think we have to sort of force people to think about poetry 1 month out of the year. Otherwise, they won't. And otherwise, teachers might lose poetry from their curriculum. And I can say for myself, it's the time of the year I earn the most money. Because I say to schools and I say to libraries and national parks and organizations, hey, it's National Poetry Month. Would you like a poet? And then they think, yeah, National Poetry Month. Okay, sure, we'll do something. Regardless of the fact that we have to trick people, perhaps, into reading poetry or experiencing poetry, if we can just expose them to poetry in some way, is that a bad thing?
It's not. And I agree. All those great things that come out of it are good. I just think it's sad that it has to come down to that, and that it probably came about as a marketing tactic,
Right.
to sell poetry books. But I remember, I can't remember who it was, but years ago I read an article by some old grouchy poet. I can't remember if it was Donald Hall or who it was, but he did this stance, and it was tongue in cheek, but he said that poetry should be banned nationally, and that it should be harder to get. And then the right people would search it out, and it would be meaningful to them the way it should be.
Scarcity.
Exactly. And he said, this is the typical American way. We don't appreciate something right until it's scarce. And then, he said he hated that it was seen as some kind of like a new age medicine or some kind of a therapy for people, when it should be something that can privately transform someone. And I never really did that many readings or anything, and until I had a book come out, and I was kind of forced to do it. But even when I had the poetry journal, I always hated when we had to take it public, where we had to do readings and we had to campaign for money and we had to market the journal, because the part that I liked was, going to the mailbox and seeing a new Anthony Heck poem. So I did it for really selfish reasons. And I guess I didn't always like all of the public notoriety that was sometimes necessary to sell things. And I remember, some of the poets who were held up as really good poets, say like a Billy Collins or Maya Angelou. They almost were good at being stand-up comics too. They could get up there and sway an audience. They had an easygoing nature. They had a certain public persona. And then you hear someone like a Robert Penn Warren or a Robert Frost, and they can sound very gravelly, and they read too quickly, and they're not doing their own work justice sometimes. So there's that strange thing between, sometimes an actor can be a very good reader of a poem in a public space. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's better than the poet themselves reading it.
Well, and this is actually a question I've had for years regarding this, and that is the performative aspect of it. Being able to read it well or have some charisma, capture a room with a look or a tone in your voice, etc. On a spectrum, right? You have like slam poetry on one end, and that very performative element. How do you kind of square those two? Because they're related, but they're not always, I don't know, they're not always complementary of one another, or they can detract from each other.
When we're talking about ancient poetry, it was an oral tradition, and so there definitely was spoken poetry before there was written poetry, and I think that aspect, at least from my own perspective, is very important. I read my poems out loud as I'm writing them. I would want readers to do the same. And that's what I was talking about, even memorizing them. Like, that would be my highest compliment if someone told me that they memorized my poem and would recite it when they were taking a walk in the woods, or something like that. So yeah, it's the strange thing, because it's created in solitude, and then it also enters readers in solitude, just with that page before them. And yet it also becomes public speech. And it also is a voice. And that's what I was saying. That's what always got me from my childhood, too. I always had certain voices in my head that I remembered, and I was captivated by different voices. And I think that each poem also has a voice, and you want that to be a memorable voice. There are these several different places that a poem goes, from utter privacy, writing for the drawer the way that Emily Dickinson did, to becoming something written but silent, and then each reader can activate that by reading it out loud and can make it this public thing. And so there's not many things like that. I mean, I guess you could think of Beethoven writing something in deafness,
Yeah.
putting it down on a page just as dots, and then this thing can be reactivated into some of the most amazing sound that's ever been created. So this is the magic and the mystery that we talked about earlier.
One of my favorite all-time poems is Robert Frost Birch's, and your poem, "The Swing," reminds me a little bit of it. Would you be willing to read that?
Sure. This was one of my first finished poems.
Was it?
Yeah. So this goes back to one of my earliest poems that I've actually kept. So my daughter is 27 now, and you'll see in the poem that she's 3 years old. The Swing, for Shannon. Just 3 years old and giggling hard, you swing with legs outstretched and buoyant, up and down, an arcing pendulum within this ring of sycamores. Their leaves your whirling gown. While night-starved shadows hunt to have their fill, momentum's push and pull unfurls your hair. You clamber up in increments until the rusted S-hooks creak their years of wear. No fear of falling breaks your fluid glide. My hand has steadied every dive to earth. Forgive my now unneeded push as you ride on a force yours alone. The heights are worth the hanging on, the pause at the chain-tight pivot before each plunge, your pendant knees keeping the time, my hand far from your flight, as there, alone, you see what's past the trees.
What I kept, because of your preface, do you look back on that now that she's 27 and think differently, or?
Well, it's more heartbreaking because it's
Sure.
it's further away. So yeah, there's definitely that pang of a parent in it. Even then, imagining her much older, and then reading it now when she is much older, I realize how true it was.
Well, it's interesting. Whenever someone says that they like one of my earliest poems, it always makes me feel a little bit insecure. Like, oh my God, I've gone downhill. So I don't know if you feel the same way, David, but I'm always looking for people to like my most recent work to sort of show that I'm getting better,
Growing.
that I'm growing as a poet versus, oh, I had a couple good ones that were lucky when I started off, and now I don't know what I'm writing.
Yeah, this is how Paul McCartney feels when he says, "I'm going to play a new song now." Yeah, and she was a singer. She always was a singer. She was on American Idol twice and ended up doing this in a much more professional way.
This is your daughter?
My daughter,
Oh,
yeah.
no
Wow,
kidding.
amazing.
So when I think back, I realize that, that's one of the things. I didn't bring it into the poem, but one of the reasons why she loved to swing so much is she always was so entranced by rhythm. And so I wanted something that really had that back and forth of the swing, and I really tried to make the lines as musical as possible and to play with things like, talking about, like the fulcrum of a seesaw, and having the lines constantly counterbalance and going back and forth. So I think more of that now, as I go back and I think of, just how much she likes singing and liked music.
Can I ask you, maybe both of you too, on this note, just because I'm interested in what you just described, kind of the background or the behind the curtain kind of aspect of a poem. How do you feel about that when someone says, "Hey, what's this about?" or "What does this mean?" or and how comfortable are you sharing some of that behind the curtains thought, or do you want to leave it up to the reader to interpret?
Well, I think that's one of the good things about something like a poetry reading or National Poetry Month. For people who don't read poetry every day, I think it does help to preface things a little bit like people do at a reading and say, this is what you're going to hear. Here's a couple of references in there that you might not know, or this is what I was trying to do, or you'll note the form that I've used or the rhymes or something like that, because I think it can be daunting if people only read prose and then they just pick up a poetry anthology and start reading. So I think for those kind of things, it is good to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, because I do think that it gives an appreciation. I mean, I always liked reading interviews with poets too, because, for the same reason. Because sometimes there would be a poem that would escape me and I never really liked, and suddenly I hear something they say in an interview and it opens up another window into it, and then I go back to it and appreciate it that much more. Do you have that, Jody?
I absolutely have that. On the other hand, I do get a little bit annoyed when people pry too much. It sort of makes me feel like maybe the poem hasn't done sufficient work on its own, or that people are just sort of, I think Billy Collins had that, speaking of Billy Collins, had that metaphor of tying the poet to the chair and beating them for an answer.
Right, torture it out of them. Yeah.
Torture it out of them. What is the poem really about? So that part of it is annoying. Ideally, the poem should speak for itself in large part, but that isn't to say that it can't be elucidated by a little bit of information, like what you're talking about, say, reading an interview or maybe setting up the backstory a little bit. I have a poem about almost drowning on the Zambezi River, and I think it is helpful when I'm giving a reading to talk about, how did I end up on the Zambezi River on a whitewater rafting trip in the first place? And sometimes I add in that I thought I was going to die at one point. Maybe that's too much information that the reader doesn't need to know. But I think it can highlight, as long as it's not too much.
Right. And sometimes people go too far. I remember it may have been Philip Levine. He has some poem about a twin, and he's not real flattering talking about his twin. And someone at the reading during the Q&A afterwards said, what does your twin brother think about this poem? Because you don't put him in a flattering light. And he said, I don't have a twin.
I know.
Yeah, so sometimes, it is just a poet imagining something, and it has nothing to do with their lives, and it's something they read or some mask that they're donning that has nothing to do with their life. And of course, that's fine too.
But I'll say that, and I appreciate you both indulging me with the question, because as the non-poet here, I agree with exactly what you both said, is that there's a balance between understanding what's in the head of the creator and the magic of how I'm feeling about it. And if you can balance the two without overdoing one or the other, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, and sometimes I think in our day and age we condemn people so easily. So people will never see a Woody Allen film again because of what they think his behavior was in his personal life, or something. And I think there was other time periods where that wasn't done as much. The painter Caravaggio was a murderer, and no one ever said we're going to take down all of his paintings and never look at them again.
Well, by that standard, we'd have very little art,
Right?
Right, exactly.
At all in any medium. Yeah.
Right, because people could be really despicable in their private lives.
On the Everything Bagel podcast, we always ask like one final question, it being the Everything Bagel and all, and that is, how do you like your bagel?
I'm not saying this just to flatter you, but I do like an everything bagel. If I don't have an onion bagel, I get an everything bagel.
And do you like it toasted? Do you like cream cheese on it? Do you like
toasted with cream cheese? Is just fine.
Well, with that, thank you for joining us for Pandemic Poetry Month.
Well, thanks. I think it was a healthy thing for all of us.
No, it's been great. I think we'll end with a poem, yeah?
Let's end on an uplifting poem, The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free.